This is Global Health, and I'm Gail Fraser. We're going to be discussing Unit 7 now. This is the first part, and we're going to be talking about refugees. But first, let's just take a look. We have some interesting information presented in a colored circle. And I think that this is updated for 2014 about the world population. What the graphic is telling us is that various parts of the world, so we're talking about as if the whole world population was 100 people. So what they're looking at is percentages. So basically, if you look here, we're saying that half the population are women, half the population are men. Some countries there are more differences, say in China, where people would, since they're only allowed to have one child, very often they'll select having a male or a boy. And that means that there's a disproportionate number of young men in China. There are too few women because things have gotten out of balance. But overall, the world population is half men and half women. If we continue around the circle here, we're talking about ages. So we have a great majority of people are in this green band here, where 66% are less than 64 but over 15. So these are young adults and mature adults, and it's indicating that 8% are over 65. If we continue on around the circle here, we look at religion. 33% of the world's population are Christian. That means that, that 77% are not Christians, and of those, 22% are Muslim. We continue around the circle here. 17% of people are not able to read. College education. Only 7% of people have college degrees. That means 93% of the world's population do not have college degrees. Of course, in Colombia, the educational rate is much higher. So again, it depends on the individual countries. Some countries, again, India and China, there are far fewer people that have higher degrees, probably. We go here to internet. 30% can contact the internet. That means 70% cannot. So you have to keep these things in mind. Even though this is the information age, a great part of the world population does not have access to the internet. Let's go on to the next slide, where I actually talk about some of the points on these, this graphic, the circle world. If the world population was 100 people, that means that 5% of the world's population speak Spanish. That's good news. But 5% also speak English. 12% speak different dialects of Mandarin or other Chinese languages. 7% have a college degree. We mentioned that. 33% are Christian. Now we're going to go into some of the factors related to survival. 87%, so that's very good, have clean water, but that means that 13% do not have access to safe water. 43% live on less than $2 a day. So that would be extreme poverty. That means that almost half the world's population is in extreme poverty. And these are the things that we can actually work on and try to relieve. 15% are malnourished. So that's a lot of, and mostly children. So keep in mind that even though things are very sophisticated, especially in Bogota, that in the world population as a whole, there's a lot of room for improvement and things that you could invest time in. Today we're going to be talking about refugees and displaced persons. I'm going to be showing you some videos of both Syria as well as Egypt, because they are representative of many of the problems that are happening in the Middle East right now. And I'm going to compare it to Colombia, because in Colombia we have a lot of desplazados. We have people that are forced out of their homes due to the guerrilla activity in Colombia, and it's getting, it's like 4.1, 4.5 million people in Colombia that are displaced. So it's actually a very good example. So let's watch this video. see if I can get it.
Winter is coming, but 13,000 Syrians living in this refugee camp are feeling nothing but heat as tension between Syria and Turkey threaten to spread the conflict over the very border they escaped. Once again, WFP is on the front line between hunger and hope. Killer's camp is literally on the border between Turkey and Syria. Just beyond that wall where those flags are in the distance, there's an area that's controlled by the rebels. Abu Naif is 41, a construction worker, and one of the more than 100,000 Syrians now living in Turkey. He told us he and his family fled Aleppo 7 months ago when his house was destroyed. Only a few belongings were saved. They were 8 living in this prefab shelter, but 2 days ago baby Ahmed joined them, a new life in an uncertain future. Like almost everyone here, Abu Naif has mouths to feed and no work. So, WFP and the Turkish Red Crescent are providing e-cards that enable them to buy food in the market, allowing refugees to get what they want when they need it, and helps boost the local economy.
We give a chance to people to sell their food. The supermarket owner told me he has 17 Turkish working, in his supermarket.
It's a system WFP uses in situations like these, where food is available locally, but economically out of reach.
Why is it better? Because you have access to fresh food, you have access to chicken, you have access to meat.
Small luxuries like a TV can be less of a comfort and more a painful reminder of what's happening back home. Abu Naif has his hands full these days, but at least feeding his family is one less thing he has to worry about.
So let's continue with our discussion. We wanted to look at community health as a whole in places where there's a conflict zone. The reason that people are refugees or displaced from their homes and fincas and communities is because of conflict. So we're going to be comparing Egypt with Colombia. We'll be talking about the United Nations and the International Covenant of Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, and what are the effects of transnational corporations on health and human rights. It's interesting because, of course, we look to businesses as well as national governments to provide funding for the United Nations because all the member states actually contribute money to support the UN activities. And so that is one of the ways that transnational corporations can actually contribute to the UN. United Nations, again, the ICESCR. What are the health consequences of development and globalization? How did they affect the international monetary institutions? So the IMF is one of the organizations that provides billions of dollars to different countries. Even Colombia qualified for IMF funding and World Bank funding for Transmillennia, for the big bus system that is here in Colombia. They understand that people need to get to work and they need transportation to do it. In Colombia, they chose to have a big network of buses. Some places they choose to have trains. Other types of transportation are paid for, and infrastructure projects are very often sponsored by the World Bank or the IMF. So again, as an example, how economic institutions actually support and corporations support. We're looking for the epidemiology of inequity, meaning the spread in global health. If you have a map showing different places where the health effects are very inequitable, unfair, meaning that because someone lives in, say, South Africa, where they're talking about apartheid and the human rights abuses that happened in South Africa, which have now been abolished, people could actually say they're actually dying for growth, meaning that the economic development also brings jobs and livelihoods, which then in turn support families to be able to work their way out of poverty. Poverty is one of the contributing factors to overall global health problems. Inequity, or an equitable hierarchy of social structures, again, affect the global health. Dying for growth, if you're looking at in recent history, in 40-year span, the portion of the income in the hands of the poor actually decreased from 2% down to 1.2%. So that means that more and more people at the top end who are already rich are getting richer, and the poor, unfortunately, are becoming more unfortunate because things are going up. Costs of living are increasing, yet they're set less than $2 a day that 43% of the world's population make is not changed. The world's richest portion of income rose from 70% to almost 90%. And again, that this is a representative of 160 countries. There are 274 countries in the world, but again, we're talking about developed countries that have affluence. The impact of the free trade agreement. I know that many of you were concerned about it, and your families are being affected by the FTA. And we were going to eliminate tariffs, and this has been approved, and again, for greater trade opportunities between Colombia and other places, including Canada and the United States. And what are some of the potential positive and negative impacts? So again, we're talking about economics and development as being a support for poverty reduction, as well as impacts on global health. So the impact of the free trade agreement, we have positive impacts. So we're looking at the potential positive impact of allowing easier access to markets, permit to sell products without tariffs, so that things could be more equitable. National products, cheese, for example, in Colombia is excellent. But if they brought imported cheeses from Canada, say, would they be able to compete for price? People could select either product equally because the Canadian cheese is no longer taxed. President Santos has said that the FTA will help Colombia consolidate itself. It will make it more aggressive in its pricing and make it more efficient in its production of goods. The possible negative impacts, again, we might be diluting the market, meaning causing too much to be available. I know that chicken farms in Colombia produce great products, and they were concerned that other products from countries outside Colombia might flood the market and reduce the price and make it difficult for farmers to survive. So again, there are some disadvantages. Firms that are importing Canadian goods, they actually now have a competitor. So these are the types of things that might be negative impacts that affect or destabilize the economic development within a country. In Latin America, again, they have some markedly negative inequities. And one of the things about Colombia is that we have almost a bipolar system where you've got the very, very rich, and then yet you still have a lot of people in extreme poverty, which you don't see in Bogota, but naturally you look at Cauca and other places. So we need to look at reformist models that will look at equity for economic and development that supports poverty reduction and then has a positive effect on health. Wrapping up for part one, we're going to talk about displaced communities, and in part two, continue this discussion. Thanks. This is Global Health, and I'm Gail Fraser. This is Unit 7, and the second part where we're talking about conflict zone health systems. We started the Unit 7 talking about displaced people and the impact that they have on communities. We have a lot of examples right now. Syria is in serious problems. They have ongoing civil war, and many of the people are traveling and they're being pushed out into Turkey, as we saw in the video, or they're also going into Lebanon. In Colombia, we have a lot of displaced persons because of the guerrilla activity, and a lot of the people in the southern part of Colombia actually go into Ecuador. So what happens in these places? Because when they have suddenly a lot of people that have no homes, they have no access to water, sanitation, no jobs anymore, they have no housing, they come into a country, and so that country that receives these refugees or these displaced persons, they actually have to go to a lot of expense, and this is where the International Federation of Red Cross and other humanitarian organizations come into play to actually provide the essential things for these people to survive now that they've been pushed out of their own home communities. The health systems we were just mentioning in part 1 have to do with reforms, and again, in Colombia there are a lot of different reforms that are being made available. You have an insurance card. That means that even people who have very small incomes can afford to access basic health care. And again, it leads to more equity. It makes it more fair for having equal access to health services in Colombia, and it's the same is true in Chile, Costa Rica, Argentina, and Brazil. You have to keep in mind, though, that Colombia, along with Chile and Argentina and Brazil, are relatively rich countries. Not all countries, as a matter of fact, most of the developing countries cannot afford to provide the kind of health insurance broadly to everyone the way Colombia has. The promotion of human rights, again, we're looking at access to health care and human rights and the right to health. It's a struggle against poverty. So this is the link that is apparent in all humanitarian aid. We just had a new call for proposals related to the Ebola outbreak. And again, they're looking at, as a fourth tier, poverty alleviation, which then leads to better health standards and then more access to care as a way of improving overall global health. Advocates are looking at civil liberties as well as democratic reforms, because it all is a foundation of equity. Enduring and pervasive poverty does continue to happen. We're looking at Bolivia, other parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. There are people that are desperately poor. Even in Colombia, again, we're talking about bipolar. We've got very few people that are very, very rich, the super affluent, and then we have people that are in extreme poverty. And again, this is linked to civil rights, human rights, advocacy, and these are the types of things that are very active actually in Latin America, a very positive impact. You'll find far fewer people that are as active in Africa. Let's just take this moment and also review the basics for human survival. Again, we're trying to emphasize these points so you keep them in mind all the time as you're doing the different activities for this class and as you're responding to the discussion forums. So child malnutrition and underweight. It is a millennium goal for the World Health Organization. Unsafe water and access to sanitation. Really basics. Infectious disease prevention. HIV, AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis. Again, there's a movement now, a lot of funding is being made available to eradicate polio, much the same as we've eradicated smallpox. So these are priorities for global health. Response to natural disasters. Actually, we have a natural disaster right now in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And I have some videos that are incredible, the flooding that we're having in Washington State, which is just right next door to me. Emergency preparedness for pandemics. So again, emergency preparedness for natural disasters as well as for infectious disease prevention are all global health priorities. Basics for human survival. We're looking at shelter, clothing, safety, and social engagement, because as people feel that they have a voice in making decisions for their home, their families, but also for their home and their neighborhood, their whole community. They also are more resilient. They're more likely to all pitch in and help. They won't passively say, oh, woe's me. They actually work together. So social engagement is very important, as well as security, clothing, shelter, food, and water. Let's watch a video. Let's see. Oops. I'm not sure which one it is.
Centenares de familias han salido desplazadas por los combates en el departamento del Cauca, Colombia. Ellos se resisten a volver a sus hogares ante la falta de garantías para el retorno. Mientras tanto, las que aún aguardan en sus casas viven en constante zozobra. Nuestra corresponsal desde Colombia, Angie Camacho, nos trae la historia.
Pues es preocupante que los niños lo único que tienen plasmado en su mente es la guerra.
Guerra es la palabra que muchos niños no entienden, pero que llevan dibujada en su mente. Estas pinturas, en donde plasmaron las bombas, sus viviendas destruidas y una familia que llora, fue lo que los menores quisieron exteriorizar.
Yo estaba ahí viendo televisión cuando comenzaron a hostigar y cuando salió la vecina frente diciendo que había caído una bomba, entonces no tuvo que salir.
Son las secuelas psicológicas de la guerra, cicatrices que parecen invisibles. Todos ellos son familias desplazadas por los combates en el Cauca, suroeste de Colombia. Pasaron de vivir en su tierra a sobrevivir por la caridad. Eugenia relata que como pudo se escondió bajo la cama junto a sus 3 hijos y rogó porque no fuera la última vez que los volviera a ver.
Pues sí, nos daba miedo volver, pero pues en la situación que estamos y nos toca, pues nos toca volver porque no tenemos más para dónde coger. Porque me da miedo por los niños, porque uno no sabe a qué horas va a caer una bomba y eso.
Fuera del albergue, saben que la vida continúa. Es día de mercado en el pueblo y aunque temen salir de sus casas, aseguran que de esta venta depende todo el ingreso de la semana.
Ahora 8 días no hubo mercado, porque no tanto tiroteo para lado y lado, y uno que estar aquí con tanto sonando balas para allá, para acá, uno no se puede. Entonces salimos corriendo.
Es el día a día en un país que no ha podido superar la guerra, cuya gente está dispuesta a apostarle sin vacilación a la paz. Angie Camacho, Telesur, Santander de Quilichao, Colombia.
Venga.
So we were just talking about the basics for human survival. Now let's go ahead and talk again about the responsibilities of corporations and how the economic development has a positive impact indirectly on global health. The United Nations Commission on Human Rights presents guidelines for businesses and enterprises to make a commitment. They have an obligation to support human rights. And this transnational corporations should respect and recognize the principles and norms of the United Nations human rights and their treaties. So the principles for companies, like we mentioned Amnesty International at one other point. It goes into communities to see what's really going on in countries as far as human rights and makes reports so that it makes it publicly aware of what's going on. So multinational companies have a responsibility to protect human rights, and often, unless they're forced to, companies take no action because they're worried about the political arena and they don't want to disturb the possibility of getting contracts or having economic linkages between countries. Politics sometimes gets in the way of companies actually making a contribution. Big multinational companies like oil companies that work in Colombia have what they call social responsibility programs. And they invest millions of dollars actually very quietly within the countries. For example, Occidental Petroleum, it has a $3 million commitment per year for the last 15 years working in Colombia. Yes, they have excellent contracts for very lucrative oil development areas in Colombia, but they also give back into those communities where they actually are drilling for oil in the Magdalena Valley as well as the Llanos. investing in the communities, meeting community needs for sanitation and health. So they are taking action and being responsible in supporting global health as well as human rights. But again, we have to worry about some places where they might actually be dying for platanos or just dying for food in general. We have to keep in mind that the global health has huge disparities between one group and another. So let's take a look at Colombia and Egypt. You can see geographically we're talking about Latin America versus the part of North Africa, which is immediately adjacent to the Middle East. So here's Turkey and Syria. I live in UAE. Here's Saudi Arabia. So there are lots of countries that are in the Middle East. Egypt as a whole is very famous historically. You know, when you think of ancient Egypt, you think of the Sinai Peninsula, you think of before 8000 BC. I mean, the incredible records and history in ancient Egypt is something we all study and are in awe of. When you think of Egypt, the first thing that comes to mind is Giza and the pyramids and the wonders of the world. It's a very, very beautiful area. Cairo and Alexandria are actually really big, bustling cities with a lot of the same kind of problems that you have with congestion and pollution that you'd have in any big city, however. But think about ancient Egypt, and they have it's supposed to be the cradle of civilization. The Rosetta Stone was proven to be the most ancient document in Mesopotamia in 196 BC. So incredible history. You think about hieroglyphs, and you think of the pyramids. The tomb of Tutankhamun, it's the most spectacular tomb that was uncovered and showed a lot about the Egyptian ancient culture. Everything was covered in gold. So again, Egypt is a very rich country. The Sphinx, you think of how that the sand has worn away these magnificent carvings. But modern Egypt has a lot of the same problems of any developing country. It's one of the most populous countries in Africa, and again in the Middle East. 80 million people in a country that's about 1/4 the size of Colombia. You can see that it's very much developed all right along the Nile River. You can see the lights. And of course this is Cairo at the tip, and then Alexandria here is on the coast. The revolution, this Arab Spring, had a very negative impact on every country in which it occurred except Tunisia. So you have to keep in mind that this is 3 years later, and the revolution in Egypt has still caused great disruption in all the public systems, including the health system. There were communities and people were rising up to overthrow the President Mubarak. He was more like a dictator, and I can understand the civil rights movement to displace him as president. Unfortunately, all the years since that's happened, everything is still very much disrupted, and it's the same is true in Libya and some other countries where the Arab Spring caused a displacement and overthrow of the government. As long ago as January 2011, thousands of Egyptians began to protest because they were saying that things were too inequitable, that there was too much poverty, unemployment, and government corruption. The protesters forced President Mubarak to step down, but the chaos and the negative impact is continuing. These pictures that you see from 4 years ago are still pretty much the same. I know that the United States has urged for an orderly transition, but it has not happened. We're looking at Egypt as a profile. Let's continue with Global Health, Unit 7, and this is Part 3 of our discussion. We were wrapping up talking about Egypt and the fact that the population for Cairo is 12 million, so it's even bigger than Bogota. The actual size of the country is It's 1,000,000 square kilometers. They generally speak Arabic, so that's the primary language, but they also speak French. So if you don't speak Arabic, French would be the next language that they would be more likely to understand, and also Italian because of the influence of the Mediterranean countries. 58% literacy, so there's quite a bit of illiteracy, and the per capita income is $4,000 a year. So again, it's a moderate income country. There are people that are very rich, but there are more people that actually are poor, and it's primarily Sunni Muslim, which is a gentler, less active Muslim culture, and Coptic Christians. And in Egypt, they're always having conflicts between the Coptic Christians and the Muslims. It's not so much between the two types of Muslims that you have conflict. So let's just watch a video related to refugees in the Middle East.
I left Syria because of the shelling and the fighting. I came to Turkey because I was scared for my children. Before, the situation was better than now. All the Syrians were living well, but there's no revolution or reward. It's the poor people who lose in this war. They don't have the money for food.
The situation here is very bad. We are living with just the clothes on our backs. You can see how it is. We're living in the street without anything.
So you can see that the revolution has had a very negative impact on the communities as a whole and health systems in particular. People no longer have access to the public health systems, and therefore the immunizations, all the basic primary health care is not happening, and people are endangered with their health. So let's take a look at Colombia. Again, you're much more familiar with the Colombia. You got 46 million people, so it's about half as many as in Egypt. The population for Bogota, if you include the different surrounding areas, is almost 8 million, so quite a bit smaller than Cairo. It's about the same size, about 1,000,000 square kilometers. Your primary language is Spanish, and I know that many of you are proficient in English, and the university professors and so on. A lot of the things, commerce is done in English, but Spanish is a primary language. You primarily have Roman Catholic communities, and the literacy rate is 93%. So the literacy rate is much, much higher educational level for a country that's similar in size, but has about half the population of Egypt. I think we've already watched that video. So let's look at them when we're thinking about case studies and things that affect and impact global health. So life expectancy in Colombia, it's 71. But again, there are lots of people that are over 100 in Colombia. It's one of the second most common pop countries. Spain and Colombia have the highest number of people that are over 100 years old. Life expectancy is Egypt is 68, so it's less. Maternal mortality, again, 76 out of 100,000 births, 84, so the maternal mortality rate is better in Colombia. The under 4 mortality is 19, and you can see it's much, much higher in Egypt per 1,000 live births. You can see that the number of doctors you have is fewer in Colombia, but I believe that having worked in Egypt, that the quality of the doctors in Colombia is far superior than the quality of the physicians that are available in Egypt. And the number of nurses, you can see Colombia has far more nursing staff than Egypt. So you can see there's a better mix of the actual clinicians in Colombia. Let's switch slides. So let's go on to challenge you with some discussion questions. I'm hoping that you will enter your thoughts and ideas in answering these questions into our discussion forum online, so we can have an online chat. The United Nations and Amnesty International call on corporations to promote human rights and invest in communities where they work. So this is something that, can you say whether that's right or wrong, or what barriers did we talk about in our presentations about corporations and their social responsibility? The second thing that we need to consider is Egypt. How similar is it to Colombia, meaning that they have a great disruption with the Arab Spring Revolution. They overthrew the president, and so the conflict zone there has to do with the disruption of normal services and having refugees moving away from areas of violence. The same is true in Colombia. Colombia is a richer country than Egypt, and how is that kind of a moderating factor related to Egypt? The third topic here is Egypt has twice as many people that have a lower educational level, and how is that associated with the economic opportunities? Because we're looking at linkages between poverty alleviation and global health, overall community health. And whether they have livelihoods and work is very much related to their educational level. It's all related, interrelated. In Egypt, they've got internally displaced persons as well, and we also were looking at Syria. So the violence erupted in 2011. There are lots of people who have gone from Syria into Egypt. Refugees from Libya as well. So they are being, they have a country, Egypt is a country where they have disruption within themselves from the Arab Spring Revolution, but they also have refugees coming in from Syria and from Libya that are overburdening systems there. Asylum seekers, so these refugees are now wanting to stay in Egypt. They don't want to go back to Libya or Eritrea or some of the other countries in which they come from. So that has a huge impact on global health within Egypt and within the region. In Colombia, the desplazados, according to the UN Refugee Agency, the armed conflict in Colombia has led to paramilitary forces being able to disrupt people, pushing them away from their fincas. To get the lands and territories and paramilitary forces out of the farmers' way, they have to seek other alternative places to live. So that's why people that would have rich farms are now in shanties around big cities like Santa Marta, around Bogota. They've moved because they have been thrown away from their land. And there's a great fear of retribution, meaning the paramilitary groups take over an area and they, as I understand it, threaten the families, so they leave to save their lives. So I think that the security controls that allow and facilitate this displacement are the things that President Santos and the discussions for peace talks in Cuba with the FARC and other military groups is very important for resolution of this problem. It's something that's long-standing. One of the things we wanted to look at is, according to the UN, we have a major crisis in Colombia because more than 4 million people are affected by this. There are only that many displaced persons in places that have civil war, like Sudan. It's a huge problem, and there are not easy solutions. But you have to keep in mind, since I have 3 children and one of those is a son, if moms were in charge of the entire world, there would be no more war, because we hate to have our families threatened. We hate to think that some harm coming to your brothers or sisters, or for me and my children or my grandchildren. So we would try to figure out ways to avoid war. have to consider the fact that these displaced people have a huge impact on the communities in which they come, meaning, for example, the Colombians that live now in Ecuador. The Ecuador doesn't have the resources to support them. There's no housing, so they have temporary shelters. These are all things that are have tremendous impact on resources from the United Nations, from the World Health Organization, from International Federation Red Cross and Red Crescent, and also other humanitarian organizations to try to provide support for these families, make sure that they have safe water, shelter, clothing, and the adequate nutritious food to eat. So wrapping up, we're looking at public health challenges in the conflict zones. What are your thoughts on that, now that we've compared and contrasted the displaced persons in Libya, Egypt, Syria, and the impact they have on the surrounding countries? The countries that are receiving the refugees are Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt, even though Egypt is also affected by conflict. We have the situation in Colombia where we've got conflict. We have some reading that I'm hoping you complete related to Colombia, and compare them. Compare and contrast. What comments do you have for the discussion forum? Thank you very much.